Welcome to SST8's series on evidence-based instructional strategies. This webinar is one in our series of webinars on evidence-based instructional strategies. The intent of these webinars is for teacher-based teams, individual teachers, or building level teams to view and discuss this content while providing flexibility in meeting your professional development needs. For example, you may choose to chunk the content and break it up over multiple days, or you may wish to use it as part of a professional development day. This webinar will focus on the topic of student engagement. To support your learning during this session, you will want to access our evidence-based strategies student engagement resource document to use throughout the training. So gather your team members and let's get to it. Let's start by taking a look at some interesting statistics published in November of 2019. These come from the National School Voice Report, a decade of data. The total number of respondents was 452,329 students in grades 6 through 12. Our first statistic states only 56% of students report that their teachers make an effort to get to know them, and only 49% believe teachers care about their problems and feelings. At this time, decide if you agree or disagree and why. From the same study, 42% of students say teachers make school an exciting place to learn, and 44% say school is boring. Again, do you agree, disagree, and why? Keep your responses in mind, and let's take a look at one more statistic. 77% of students say they put forth their best effort, and 90% say getting good grades is important to them. Do you agree or disagree? At this time, find the 3 statements on your student engagement resource document, pause the webinar, and take a few minutes to share out your thoughts with your team. Resume the video when you are ready to continue. Keep these statistics in mind as we progress through this webinar. Much of the information that will be shared in this webinar is based on the book Engagement by Design, Creating Learning Environments Where Students Thrive by Doug Fisher, Nancy Fry, Russell Quaglia, Dominique Smith, and Lisa Land. As stated on the back cover of the book, consistently finding a rhythm where students progress through relevant and challenging content isn't easy. But not only is it possible, it can also seem effortless when teachers have the right design for genuinely engaging students. Why is student engagement an important topic? Student engagement has been found to be predictive of a wide variety of desired academic and life outcomes, such as increased academic achievement, reduced dropout rates, increased participation in and graduation from post-secondary programs, a decrease in risky behaviors, including delinquency and substance abuse, and an increased satisfaction with life and overall well-being. Engaged classrooms don't just happen, whether we are talking about traditional brick and mortar classrooms or virtual classrooms. They are led by teachers who deeply understand their craft and the essential nature of the interaction between student, teacher, and content. As we begin our discussion on student engagement, let's take a look at our learning intentions. We have 3 learning intentions centered around student engagement for this session. Our content learning intention is that you will be able to define and understand the 3 strategies in the balanced model for optimal learning in the book Engagement by Design. The language learning intention is that you will reflect on, discuss, and share new thinking around student engagement. And for our social learning intention, you will participate in conversations and collaborate with team members to increase your impact on student learning through student engagement. Before we dig into the specifics around student engagement, let's talk a little about the research. When we discussed John Hattie's work around visible learning, Conversations generally focus on effect sizes. In his research, John has found that the average effect size over all effects that he has studied is 0.4. Hattie considers the 0.4 effect size to be a marker that represented a year's growth per year of schooling for a student. Anything above 0.4 would have a greater positive effect on student learning, hence his idea of a hinge point. Notice on the slide the three areas that overlap to create the balanced model for optimal learning in engagement by design: the student, the teacher, and the content. In the section of the Venn diagram where students and teachers overlap, we have student-teacher relationships. When we interweave teachers with their content, we have teacher clarity. And when we look at the intersection between students and content, we are talking about challenge. As we begin to look a little closer at the three areas in the balanced model, note that teacher-student relationships have an effect size of 0.48, teacher clarity has an effect size of 0.76, and a high level of challenge has an effect size of 0.57. All of these have an effect size above the 0.4 hinge point. The first area we will look at is teacher-student relationships. According to John Hattie's research, the effect size of teacher-student relationships is 0.48. This is slightly above the average effect size of 0.4. The four general conditions needed to develop a relationship include respect, honesty, trust, and communication. Each of these plays an important part in any relationship we have, no matter the age or connection. A key understanding when it comes to teacher-student relationships is that this information does not suggest that teachers should become friends with their students. That is a misinterpretation of the research-based recommendations. Friendships require a level of equality, and teachers should be friendly but also maintain the role of the mentor, guide, advocate, and leader. We develop these relationships in the hope that we can positively impact the cognitive and behavioral successes of our students. Without this focus, there really is no reason for the significant amount of time that teachers and students spend together. More than 27% of students don't think that their teachers expect them to be successful. Reflect for a moment on the positive teacher-student relationships you have developed and the academic and behavioral outcomes for those students, and contrast that with the students that you struggle to develop a relationship with. Is there a difference? There are three components when it comes to developing teacher-student relationships. First, the relationship must be invitational. The student must feel invited into the learning space, both psychologically as well as physically. Second, the learning space must also be equitable. Every student must feel that they have a chance to develop meaningful relationships with the teacher, as well as other students in the learning environment. And lastly is the component of advocacy. Positive relationships are more likely to develop if all members of the classroom feel emotionally safe and that the teacher will advocate for them when needed. Healthy teacher-student relationships remove a lot of learning barriers for students, allowing them to feel safe enough to focus on the lessons presented to them. If we know this to be true, then what do you do if you don't have a positive relationship with one of your students? One strategy that has been found to be successful is the 2x10 strategy. Let's take a closer look. The 2x10 strategy has three simple steps. 1, focus on your most difficult student. 2, for 2 minutes a day, 10 days in a row, have a personal conversation with that student. And 3, talk about anything the student is interested in. If the student happens to be absent or you miss a day within that 10-day window, you will need to start the 10 days in a row over again. When studying the 2x10 strategy and the positive outcomes after implementing the strategy, Lodkowski found there was an 85% improvement in that one student's behavior. The behavior of all the other students in the classroom improved, And the worst student became an ally in the class when the teacher forged a strong personal connection with that student. Let's think about a student with whom you would like to develop a more positive relationship. What are some things that you might want to talk with them about when you see them next? At this time, pause the video and locate the box at the bottom of page 1 on your resource document. Think of a student and write their first initial in the box on your document. Think about what you want to talk with them about, and then in the box, write down the topic or questions you want to ask them when you see them. Your team may wish to take a few moments to share out your topics or questions and discuss, and then resume the video when you and your team are ready to move on. Okay, let's move on to the second critical area in the balanced model for optimal learning for student engagement, and that would be teacher clarity. When we talk about teacher clarity, we need to consider, do we as teachers understand the standard, including the expectations of the standard? This may include asking ourselves, does this standard require knowledge, conceptual understanding, application, or a combination? A second layer to this question would be determining the rigor and depth of knowledge expected within the standard. Teacher clarity also includes crafting learning intentions and determining success criteria for students. When students know what they are supposed to learn, why they are learning it, and how they will know they have learned it, they learn more, behave better, and engage in school in more substantial ways. It's a matter of thinking differently. Instead of asking, what are the students doing? The question changes to, what are the students learning? Clarity in teaching consists of components for both teachers and students. The 4 essential components are: 1, the teacher knows what students are supposed to be learning. 2, the teacher knows how students learn. 3, the students know what they are supposed to be learning. And 4, both the teacher and students know what success looks like. When we talk about teacher clarity, it is critical to pay attention to daily learning expectations or intentions if students are to organize knowledge and make connections. Learning intentions describe specifically what it is that the students will be learning during the lesson. They can also provide students with structure and clue them in on what to expect during the lesson. The daily purpose for learning optimally includes a cognitive or content learning intention, a linguistic or language learning intention, and a behavioral or social learning intention for the lesson. Let's talk about each of these types of learning intentions. As we consider content learning intentions, they should help the student answer the question, what is the content that I am supposed to learn today? These learning intentions should articulate what it is that students are learning and relate directly to the essential skills, knowledge, and understandings at the expected level of rigor presented in the standards. Language learning intentions help students answer the question, how should I communicate my thinking today? These language learning intentions should provide a venue to lay out the language demands of the day or the lesson and focus on how students will use language to access content and demonstrate understanding. These may include students using new academic or content vocabulary, explaining, arguing a position, or developing thoughts. Students may be required to demonstrate language intentions either verbally or in writing, or they may include auditory expectations and skills. As you are developing your language learning intention, ask yourself, how can students connect learning through reading and listening with writing and speaking during the lesson? The third type of learning intention is the social learning intention. Social learning intentions for students answer the question, how should I interact with my classroom community today? These intentions allow teachers to develop and leverage social and social emotional learning outcomes within their classroom culture while allowing for the opportunity to reinforce behavioral expectations within the context of the lesson and the classroom. Dividing learning intentions into content, language, and social purposes can provide both teachers and students a clearer sense of each day's expectations. Here's an example of what these three types of learning intentions might look like for an ELA lesson on characterization. The content learning intention for the day might be, we are learning about how authors use word choice in dialogue as a means for indirect characterization. The language learning intention then informs students that we will be explaining this technique using evidence from the text in a discussion with our peers. And the social learning intention explains that students will ask clarifying questions of one another to understand others' ideas. Here is another example from a high school math lesson. If you look on the board, you will see that the teacher has written his three learning intentions. The content learning intention for students is we will use our understanding of exponential functions to make informed financial decisions. The language learning intention states that students will, 1, infer mathematical meaning from a text, and 2, construct and communicate viable arguments verbally and in writing. And the social learning intention informs students that they will make sense of complex problems with their groups and persevere in solving them. As you look at one more example for a third grade reading lesson, think about one of your upcoming lessons. Please locate the learning intentions section on your resource document. You may work individually or as a team to construct your content, language, and social learning intentions. Pause the video and individually or as a team, first determine a standard, skill, essential knowledge, conceptual understanding, or application that is the focus for a lesson that you will soon be teaching. Then, create a content, language, and social learning intention for that lesson. As your team is discussing learning intentions, consider what additional adaptations you might need to include in a virtual learning environment. When you are ready to continue, resume the video. Let's talk about the third critical area in the balanced model for optimal learning, a high level of challenge, where the student engages with content. As we begin to think about the concept of challenge in the classroom, consider this quote. If students already know how to do all of the things that they are asked to do at school, then we're wasting their time. Do you agree or disagree? How does this relate to the idea of challenge? If you wish to, take a moment as a team to consider the implications of this statement and what it means to you as you and your team plan for instruction. The effect size of a high level of challenge where students meet content is 0.57, which puts it above the 0.4 effect size that John Hattie has found to be the average effect size for instructional strategies. A high level of challenge does not necessarily mean that the work is difficult, but rather it is developmentally appropriate and meets the expected rigor of the standards. It pushes student thinking. Thinking back to the statement on a previous slide, if students already know how to do all of the things they're asked to do at school, then we're wasting their time. Consider this. Research has found that 40 to 60% of instructional minutes are spent on things that students have already mastered. What implications does this have for your students? Are you having students interact with content that is the appropriate level of rigor, or do you adapt the lesson because you think it is too hard? When students interact with content, it is supposed to challenge them. Appropriate levels of challenge are an inherent part of student engagement and high expectations. This is where student thinking is stretched, which helps them to grow their own capacity for learning, confidence, and perseverance. Consider the 3 points listed on the slide. 1, challenge has a powerful impact on student learning, but we have yet to welcome the struggle. 2, challenge lies in finding solutions to situations that are complex, yet developmentally appropriate. And at their best, challenging tasks situate within the zone of proximal development so that learners stretch their thinking, which at times may result in failure. However, failure can be productive when leveraged correctly. There is a social and emotional aspect to confronting failure and pivoting to persistence, a condition that can contribute to growth mindset. A high-functioning learning community understands that failure is productive when leveraged correctly. As teachers, we inherently don't want our students to struggle. But if we can leverage the struggle, such as reserving it to take place in the presence of an adult who can provide that necessary push and appropriate supports, we can help our students to grow through their failure. Research on productive failure suggests that the more a student struggles and even fails while trying to learn new information, the more likely a student is able to recall and apply that information later. Think about a time when you personally were struggling to learn something new, like riding a bike, learning how to swim, or even driving a car. How did you feel in the moment? Did anyone provide you with support, guidance, or feedback as you were learning? Did this help you learn to persevere? How? What was the most important aspect of your success? Pause the webinar and share out your thoughts and stories, and then resume when you are ready. Two concepts to consider when thinking about challenge are difficulty and complexity. Difficulty can be the amount of work, time, or effort that the learner has to exert in answering a question, addressing a problem, or accomplishing a task. It speaks to how many people can answer a question, address a problem, or accomplish a task correctly or successfully. Complexity, on the other hand, is the kind of thinking, action, or knowledge that must be demonstrated and communicated to answer a question, address a problem, or accomplish a task. It speaks to how many different ways a question can be answered, a problem addressed, or a task accomplished. Here is one example that helps to delineate the difference between difficulty and complexity. A difficult task would be for students to read Chapter 12 in a social studies text and then have them identify and list all of the reasons Thomas Jefferson had for deploying the core of discovery. Whereas a complex task might ask students to identify one reason Jefferson sent the core of discovery to the Louisiana Territory, and then use evidence from the text to explain Jefferson's reasoning in choosing Meriwether Lewis to lead the expedition. When trying to determine the level of challenge, the verbs listed in the task can help you to determine if the task is difficult or complex, and whether it aligns to the level of rigor written into the standards. At this time, pause the webinar and locate the high level of challenge section on your resource document. Take some time to jot down some key ideas and takeaways that you want to remember about struggle and failure and task difficulty and complexity. Resume the webinar when you are ready to move on to the next part. When we intentionally design instruction with relationships, teacher clarity, and challenge in mind, it creates a win-win situation for teachers and students. When students are engaged and connect learning with their everyday lives, they are 14 times more likely to be academically motivated. Let's talk about what research tells us about engaged students. Engaged students feel like they belong. They gain as much satisfaction from knowing they persevered and gave effort as from receiving a letter grade. They continually ask why and why not. They lose track of time and space when learning. They are not afraid to fail or succeed. And they take on leadership roles and the responsibility that goes with them. They possess the confidence to take action on causes they believe in and they express their voice in a way that is recognized, valued, and heard. What are some things you can do to more fully engage students? Locate the Engaged Students table on your resource document and choose 2 to 3 of these characteristics that speak to you, and then determine specific actions that you will take to increase engagement in those specific areas. Pause the video and resume when you and your team are ready to move on. When you think about what you want your traditional or virtual classroom to look like, do any of these statements come to mind? In engaged classrooms, learning is not constrained by time. An atmosphere of respect and understanding exists. Student collaboration is the norm. Meaningful conversations flow between students and teachers. Responsibility replaces accountability. Everyone is a teacher and a learner, and all voices are heard and valued. What are some specific actions you will take to create a more engaged classroom in the next week, the next 2 weeks, maybe the next month? On your resource document, find the box labeled Engaged Classrooms. At this time, pause the webinar and respond to the prompt. As we begin to close out this session, let's take a look at the benefits of engagement by design. When you have engaged students and engaged classrooms, students will gain a greater sense of self-worth, an appreciation of other people's ideas, a greater sense of purpose in understanding who they are and thinking beyond themselves, an acceptance of different perspectives, an excitement for learning, and a willingness to take on academic challenges. They will also gain an awareness of their own ability and potential, an increased confidence and pride in their ability, respect for themselves and others, and an awareness of the potential impact of their actions on others. Engagement by design is about creating an environment in which all students thrive. It takes root when schools ensure that staff and students are deeply involved in the learning process, demonstrate enthusiasm and a desire to learn new things, and they willingly take positive, healthy steps toward the future. So what will you do differently moving forward? Thank you for your time for this webinar. For additional information on instructional strategies, please visit our website, www.sst8.org/school-improvement, or check out our School Improvement playlist on our State Support Team 8 YouTube channel.